where folks can go out and do beach cleanups. They do beach cleanups, they can do habitat restoration work, water quality monitoring, really a whole host of things to plug into the issues in their local community. And then we have programmatic work that's constantly going, where again, volunteers and community members can plug into longer term work, provide educational campaigns, all sorts of stuff to, again, embed deeper into their relationships with their community and their community's relationships to the issues. And then finally, our pretty robust campaigns and coalition building. And this is where both our chapters and our headquarters staff really coalesces in big wicked problem solutions. So clean water, major coastal resilience efforts, stuff like that. So really offer a funnel for community members to become leaders in their regions. All right. Go out and too far. Okay. One site that I wanted to highlight just to kind of start off. This is one of the places that Surfrider, I'd like to say, cut its teeth in how we engage in coastal adaptation work. I'm not sure how many folks are familiar with Surfers Point in Ventura. The sites don't really matter that I'll be talking about, but the what and how we worked, I think, is really important. So originally, this project was poorly placed. It resulted this public use infrastructure project that was bike lanes, pedestrian walkways, parking lot. Very quickly, this is 20 years later, you can see on the left after implementation that it was completely unusable regarding both the beach and the infrastructure, hazardous, and really ruining users' ability to use the ocean. As a result, the Surfrider chapter and headquarters did what we do just inherently and got to work with both advocacy work, showing up at city council meetings, talking about the issue, talking about how it was affecting the community, providing educational opportunities for the community to understand what was happening here, what had failed, and then eventually a really robust nature-based redesign campaign to re-envision this whole space as something that could be a co-benefit of resilience and usability. And that's what you see here on the right is the outcome. A fully restored beach with public use infrastructure. I think they like to tote that they didn't even lose any parking spaces through this project, which was huge. But most importantly, because of the process of having the community engaged from the onset, you can't really see it here, but user needs are baked into this project. Where breaks are in the dune system, how sand is configured, how parking lots and pedestrian, everything suits the users there. And as a result, it has enormous success in continuing stewardship from the community. The community appreciates it, uses it, it serves the community. So again, this is kind of where Surfrider just did what Surfrider does by way of being community members and coalition building and having conversations. And we're taking the information we've gained there and at a handful of other sites to really inform how we center as again, a grassroots organization that's really centered in the community, how we find a space at the table in coastal adaptation. So, just to highlight, I think this is, I keep calling it kind of a painful pill, but a lot of these projects have taken a lot of time. It was a 30-year-long project from problem to the completion of phase 2, just for any minute now. That included so much community work, so much, on the ground effort. So these projects really are long-term projects that we're having to figure out how to accelerate at the rate in which they're needed. So shifting to where we're testing this is where I'm really boots on the ground. San Onofre State Beach. We've selected this site to focus capacity and kind of test the durability of a lot of our community engagement methodologies and how we are talking to our membership and the community at large. And that's because jurisdictionally, it is really complicated. It's a native sacred site. It is owned by the Department of Defense. It is leased by California State Parks. It is supported by a local nonprofit for their interp and their education. It is tended to by a historic surfing club that you used to have to require membership to be able to access the base. And then Surfrider personally has a really long history of work here, both amazing efforts saving this area from development, and some really complicated relationships with some of these stakeholders where there have not always been very good relationships. So we thought we can test the durability of these systems here, then hopefully we can do it just about anywhere. Also geographically, it's a really interesting place in that the only way to access this beach is to be on the beach. The parking is located on the beach, which is super unusual for Southern California and California in general. That's not really something we see. There's no other parking anywhere around. Only way to access it for miles. And that beach is really, it's eroding. It's doing the thing that coastlines do. And we've seen some projects that we didn't appreciate. Revetment was put in to temporarily provide some resilience, and that's resulted in, as you can see in the bottom picture, just accelerated erosion, flanking erosion, undermining other infrastructure there. So our goal here was really to envision both long-term, midterm, and short-term solutions to maintaining access at this place. The fifth most visited state beach, and it's a very important resource to the community. So with that, like I said, I'm going to be talking about kind of our pre-planning engagement timeline, because I think that this is a really important spot that often gets missed, especially when we're in the grant writing phase, or agencies or cities who are focused on solutions kind of miss this section. And this is again, just a really important spot. So the first whole year of this campaign, we spent building relationships only. Like I said, a lot of tensions existed with our organization and a lot of the other vested stakeholders and community groups. We've been on opposite sides of issues many times, and frankly, wouldn't be able to get a meeting with a lot of these groups historically. So the first year was lunches, meetings, just going and talking, not even necessarily about the issue, but building relationships, which again is tough as a city or an agency, not having like tangible outcomes from those meetings, but really focusing on just building some baseline trust. Simultaneously, we were providing education opportunities to really communicate what is happening in this region. So this particular area is also very conservative with its views on climate change. You can't say the word climate change, can't say the word sea level rise. So trying to have these conversations in a very specific way to communicate what is happening at our coasts, what are the dynamics that exist here, why is infrastructure constantly being threatened, and trying to leave this very specific issue a little more general. From there, we moved to what I call 1.1, and that's still, again, pre-planning. We've done community action this is our community restoration event, our CAP program, where folks go out and remove invasive species and kind of have a touch point with nature-based solutions in a very high-level way, and being able to restore areas and see that effect kind of slowly over time and also get engaged. And then we held these targeted stakeholder and public pop-ups, and I'm going to explain those a little bit more because they're really important on how we kind of phase these out. So that first year was building relationships with our super core coalition of the land managers and the folks who, again, are incredibly vested. We started our first group, and these are just listening workshops, with a pretty targeted group of folks. So user groups, their representatives, tribal nation representatives, lifeguards, anglers, anyone that we all as a coalition could think of, and then put feelers out to those communities. Who uses this beach? Who uses this area? Who's vested? And that first workshop was really asking people to think broadly. We started with California State Parks providing their vulnerability assessment. Again, very, very high level. Here's what's at risk at this beach, which is pretty clear when we're talking about only one access way in that is very vulnerable. And then we asked folks with some guided questions to look at these big maps and just color them up with their thoughts of how they use the beach, what they're thinking about for the future, what they're concerned about. We adapted that into a pop-up version that we then took to the public to ask those questions much more briefly with different colored stickers. Where are you concerned? Where do you recreate? How do you access? And then lastly, we've adapted this to a GIS system where we can compile all of this in one location, as well as be able to provide some remote buy-in for folks who aren't able to come, aren't able to attend, or maybe have some kind of barriers for access to this beach, but would still like to be considered. So we're in right now the kind of last period of our pre-planning session, and that's really where we're now going to start talking to the general public about what's happening here. Surfrider has just recently received a grant to start exploring the solutions. We're going to be contracting an engineering firm to study the beach and identify what solutions exist as possibilities. And this is where we're asking anyone who cares about the beach to come in, and the format of these meetings are very specific. We are shifting from like the hour-long presentation where all of our stakeholders come up and present something and speak at the community to very brief, here's a high level of what's going on, and then an explanation that around the room, we're doing an open house where engineers, state parks, all of these different stakeholders who are at the table here, you can learn from them specifically about what's going on. This is, I think, super important for these, especially first and big community meetings, because one, it breaks up the mob, which I think is important when we're having big community conversations. But two, it allows people to learn at a pace that honors their ability to absorb this information. This is technical stuff, and it's uncomfortable and it's scary, and there's a lot of stuff that comes with adaptation in general that the public really wants to get their hands around. And if they're able to move through at their own pace, ask questions, ask it again, as opposed to this room that the time is moving through very quickly, and that discomfort of this moment's leaving and I'm not going to be able to ask my question, say my thing, whatever it might be, is really challengeable, and I think raises the temperature really quickly in a lot of these meetings. Secondly, this is an opportunity we finally have to provide an actual tangible timeline. With things being contracted, we can start providing opportunities of these are the formal opportunities for engagement. And here are all the other ways that you can stay involved. Keeping everything that's happening very transparent, updates being posted to the project websites, but just very transparent is one of our really big goals here. So that's, again, our kind of our pre-planning state here. And as we move in, we'll follow the same kind of methodology throughout. But really high level, this is what's been working at what was once a very contentious site with, again, lots of different opinions and a lot of stakeholders with very little trust. One, I think timing matters, and this is a really big deal because you're asking your public to come to a community engagement session and there's no way for their input to be considered. That's not community engagement, that's community informing. So getting those relationships started as soon as possible, again, is tough, but just imperative, making sure that you're making asks when you can still do something with those asks and you're not just listening for the sake of listening. Meeting people where they are, literally location by a way of just a couple of miles. Communities feel isolated or not included. Socially, we go to people's events, we go see them, we go do their stuff, unasking. And then really actively and radically welcoming the communities that you're asking to show up. So if there's language barriers, if there are, cost constraints, something I think to really consider here, and I didn't outline this, but food, have food at all of your events. Feed people, that does so much. The city of Santa Cruz is doing an amazing job providing gift cards to especially the low-income communities who have some trust history issues, to just help guide people to the conversation, and then again doing something with it. And then lastly, our whole methodology is based on the community. We're a community organization, and these projects again need the community to be a part of them for them to not fail the community or just fail. So really centering trust in every part of the project is vital for us. So that's me. Hope I'm still under time. And yeah, thanks.
We have time for a few questions.
Thank you very much. That was great. So my question for you is about incentivizing or supporting, getting community members to meetings in situations where it's maybe a larger impact area, it's more regional. What has been your experience or success in maybe providing transportation or incentivizing transportation, especially up in like Alaska where it's, much larger impact area? What's been your experience there?
Yeah, I mean, luckily so far, we haven't been working in areas where that kind of transportation complication exists. But I will say this site, like San Onofre State Beach in general, you have to own a car to get to. It is very, very far. So we, again, going back to the play space, we try really hard to either select sites that are within distance to transit, really central in communities that might be walkable, or if not, and this is not as desired, but offering some kind of hybrid approach, kind of like what's happening today. Not the most ideal, but when there's major constraints and barriers like that, you have a better idea. Love to hear it, but transportation can be tricky, especially for a really expansive project. Yeah.
I was curious to know a little bit about how you accessed and leveraged funding for the pre-planning process when you don't have too much to like show for it aside from building trust activities.
Yeah, should I repeat that for Zoom? So the question was funding. How do we get planning for pre-planning? How do we get funding for pre-planning? I think that's where one, creative grant writing is just really helpful, but we in particular found private funding through a couple foundations that I think, again, this is to our benefit of being an advocacy organization. There's a lot more kind of general money that comes in to support just the work that we do broadly, like the coast and climate work that we're engaged in. And that's where I would say, well, I used to say brick would be an amazing answer to that, but RIP. I think if a city or if a grant is not able to like provide those non-deliverable things that are a little more nebulous, that's where leaning on CBOs can be really helpful. And I mean, that's to the capacity of the organizations, but I know that can be a stuck point, especially for cities or agencies. So private funding.
Unfortunately, we do need to move on, but if we have more time at the end, we can open it up for everyone. But thank you, Alex. And next up, we have Richard Norton from the University of Michigan, and he actually has two presentations, one on behalf of some colleagues and then your own presentation. So I think we'll do the first, pause for questions, and then roll into the second one.
Okay. There we go. Okay. So I'm doing two presentations because I worked with some colleagues from the Association of State Floodplain Managers. We're going to be here to present this, and then thing going on, they got their funding pulled, they just weren't able to make it to the conference. So I'm Dick Norton. I'm a professor of urban and regional planning at the University of Michigan. I'm a community planner and a lawyer. I've been at the University of Michigan for almost going on 25 years, and I've really focused on Great Lakes coastal shoreline management. And written a lot both on the planning policy side of that and then on the legal side. I was part of a public trust doctrine workshop that our session we had early on. So over the course of that work, I've done work on scenario-based planning, and Jenna and Eleanor got funding to work with coastal communities to try doing scenario-based planning and a couple other methodologies to see if they could increase the capacity of local governments to do better planning. So they pulled me in to be kind of a subject matter expert to help them with that process. So I kind of wove in and out of the process over the course of the grant. And then when they announced they wanted to do this, I was like, great, I'm going to be there too. Let's work together. So I'm presenting their work on behalf of them. So just I'll give you some background about the Great Lakes, talk about the project they were undertaking, a little bit about scenario-based planning, and then what came out of this effort and what we learned from the effort. So first, just some basics. The Great Lakes are large enough to be inland seas. They're major bodies of water, but they don't fluctuate. They're not large enough to be quite tidal. So we don't get a twice daily diurnal surge, but we do get pretty substantial shifts in the standing water levels of the lakes over time, over the course of decades, which has problems. We had an unusually long period of water levels that were above the long-term average for about 30 years into the 80s. And then we had a really unusual, very low level of water for about 15, 20 years. And the one to pay attention to here is the second one down. These are hydrographs showing the monthly average standing water levels. So Lakes Huron and Michigan are, here's the mitten, right? Everybody does this if you're from Michigan. The two lakes, there's a connection at the tip of the lower peninsula. So the Lakes Huron and Michigan are connected. So they have pretty much the same standing water level. So they put on the same hydrograph. We had a long period of very low water levels. And then in 2013, we had a really sudden rise in water levels and went from all-time low to all-time high very quickly. And they're very powerful lakes. They're dangerous lakes. You've heard of the song about shipwrecks and such. They're major bodies of water. One of the problems with the lakes is when the lakes go down, the beaches inflate, kind of like a winter beach on an ocean coast, but spread that out over the course of decades. You get huge inflation of the beach. People start to feel like, oh, great, the sand's back. We can build closer to the water. Here's a house that was starting to build as the lake level after that really low water period, as the lakes were coming back up, and they kept building and the lakes kept coming up. And now you have a nice little peninsula. So that's kind of part of the setting. So here are the communities that Jenna and Eleanor worked with. So this is all about working with communities, but it's trying to get local governments to think about folding coastal shoreline management into their planning efforts. It's really hard to do. In fact, it's really hard to find communities to work with you because it's a lot of work to work with researchers who are for communities to work with. Two of them are actually on Lake St. Clair, which is technically not one of the Great Lakes. It's in between, it's a delta in between Lake Huron and Lake Erie. I tell folks it's not a Great Lake, it's a pretty darn good lake. Not a great lake. They have a little bit different dynamics going on. They convene these communities, they did a lot of what Alex just talked about, trying to get community members to engage, local officials to engage. Really hard to do. It's hard to get folks to come out. And then a lot of technical information. And they did 3 different kinds of efforts with them. One was a coastal resilience assessment that was developed by folks at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And it's basically a checklist stepping through here are the things that would make for a more resilient community. How are you doing? So they work through the communities with the assessment. They also picked up a research program that's been developed out of researchers out of Texas A&M, at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, Phil Burke. Anybody familiar with? No? Okay, Phil Burke's a really well-done coastal planner, urban and regional planner who does a lot of coastal work. They pointed out that in a lot of communities, don't have just a single community master plan. They have multiple plans. They've got downtown development plans and hazard mitigation plans and community master plans. And if you look at them carefully and you lay them on top of each other, you often discover that one of the plans, probably the downtown redevelopment plan, is promoting new urban development in exactly the same places that the hazard mitigation plan is saying, don't build here, because it's a really bad place to build. So you can't look at just a single planning document. You have to look at the networks of plans, look at all of the documents and see how they're lining up. So peers is a method that they've developed to try and do that networked scoring effort. And so they ran through with these 4 communities, the peers process as well. And then they picked up work that I've been doing with colleagues. So one of the challenges I've really confronted is that, and Alex alluded to this too, these are difficult technical issues. And let's just say it right up front, local officials are not dumb. They're usually quite smart. They've got a lot of good common sense. They haven't had the luxury of taking the time to study planning processes or to study complex technical issues like coastal dynamics, and they have to make decisions now. And they do that in the moment, given pressing demands. And then, oh, by the way, when the lakes are low and people aren't clamoring because of hazards, they've got a ton of other stuff to worry about. So there are big salience issues in the Great Lakes as well. So how can we come up with a planning method that lays out for them the uncertainty that we're now dealing with because of climate change? You can't predict and plan anymore. So maybe lay out an array of scenarios or climate futures from kind of worst case to best case, and then set them against different management options a community might undertake to see what do you get when you do those. So this scenario, decision-centered scenario-based planning, is a paper we published in the Journal of the American Planning Association. Try and get communities to better take uncertainty into their planning and to make better decisions by folding in the outcomes of decisions they might make into their planning efforts. So they ran through all of their study communities this process. And we developed the method by trying to use off-the-shelf data, if you will, FEMA firms, flood insurance rate maps, GEMs that are available from NOAA and from the USGS, historic information, whatever information we could get from a community that was readily available. Eleanor did an amazing job of, we did kind of a first cut at this for the paper we published. She really worked with the communities to beef up in a big way the kind of data they were pulling into their maps. The 2 big assumptions that we're dealing with in the Great Lakes is that the lake levels themselves fluctuate over time, and we're seeing increasing storminess. So we are feeling, if you were at the plenary today, you know, there are migration or people moving north. The Great Lakes keep popping up as a place for climate migrants to move to because relatively speaking will be less affected, but we're definitely seeing more storminess. And I'm actually going to talk about this more in my presentation, but the shorelines of the Great Lakes are slowly receding landward, most of them because they're sandy, highly sandy and erodible beaches. So we're dealing with kind of like sea level rise, but it's because of erosion, not because the sea levels aren't rising. So here's St. Clair Shores. It's one of the communities that's on Lake St. Clair. It's a much more shallow lake than the other lakes, and the topography of the community is very shallow. So if you start to see any flooding, you see it come inland very quickly. In fact, most of Lake St. Clair has been armored with fairly low seawalls to try and stop that from happening. But of course, now that's created the problem when they get a major rain event, it gets trapped behind the seawall. So it's exacerbating flooding from the landward side of things. So when our method was to identify a best case to worst case scenario. We called the best case scenario is the lucky storm event. When the lakes are pretty low and you get just a 50-year storm event, how much will you flood? Well, look at that. How much of that shoreline area is already susceptible to flooding because they're just so low and close to the water. That's the lucky is on the far left. So a little bit of flooding. The expected kind of lakes are at their long-term average level, and you've got a 100-year storm event. What are you going to see flood? Now you're going to start to see a lot of flooding. The perfect storm is, oh my gosh, the lakes are close to their all-time high, and you've got a major storm event. How much of it will flood? One of the things they very quickly realized is that even our methods for assessing this were underestimating the risks. So they actually beefed up how much flooding they're likely to see given future events. And we're talking millions of dollars of damage in their expected conditions. Who's going to pay for that? Well, then they tried to link that to what we called for next was map out what you got under your current build out. That's the baseline. try and do a build out assessment based on what you would get using your zoning code. Most communities have overzoned for development. There's still a lot of room to build. And then maybe fold in some basic BMPs like setbacks from water. When they got to that with St. Clair Shores, they hit a roadblock because nobody wanted to talk about what we might get if we build out or how we might mitigate it. That's just too scary. And the idea of even thinking about relocating was just immediately, we're not going to talk about that. So all they could do with this community was lay out the current conditions and the risks that they're currently under. They couldn't even go beyond that in their discussions. And they took that to do some action planning. So they did the same process with New Baltimore, which is another St. Clair Shore or Lake St. Clair community a little bit to the north. They produced a whole bunch of final products. They're really cool. Vulnerability assessments, action plans, that pull it all together. And there's a QR code if anybody wants to chase them down. So this is all available from the Association of State Floodplain Managers. Leave that up for a second, just to take a picture. And then I asked them, okay, what are they doing now that they weren't doing before? So Lake St. Clair Shores did update their comprehensive plan, and they're now addressing flood mitigation concerns in a way they hadn't been doing before. Okay, so there's been a heightened awareness. They're looking for funding opportunities to try and do more planning at that front. And at least they've become more intentionally proactive of thinking about reducing flooding risk, especially inland flooding risk. That's where they have a lot of trouble. They've got a very sophisticated infrastructure management system because they deal with inland flooding quite a bit. So they are working on it. New Baltimore is a smaller community. They really hit the wall when they got to the politics of, oh my gosh, we might have to tell people to move. That just kind of shut everything down. So they didn't want any of their planning analyses made public. So that's why I'm not showing them to you. So they did do some community outreach. They're focused on a park, but they're very cautious about publicizing the outcomes of their analysis. Duluth, if you know anything about Duluth, there's a long spit. Duluth is up in the very bottom part of Lake Superior. There's a long spit of land that reaches out. It gets the full force of the fetch across the lake. There's, of course, they built homes along that spit. So you've got 2 rows of homes on either side that periodically get overwashed with storms, and they really want to become more resilient, which in their minds thinking armoring. Well, that's probably not a good long-term solution. And it's really a community group that's been driving the effort there. And so interestingly, we can talk about some lessons learned. All of the communities immediately rejected managed retreat as a feasible option. We're just not going to go there. It's too painful. People have property rights. They've already developed. It's too late. Interestingly, in the Duluth community, where it's the community members who are driving this, they're kind of recognizing, you know what, maybe we need to start talking about retreating because it's becoming clear to us it's a losing proposition to try and armor. But wow, did it take a whole lot of discussion and dialogue and engagement for all of that to sink in and to start thinking about it. So often it's the process as much as the outcome that gets you where you need to go. St. Clair Shores and New Baltimore are still focusing on stormwater management. They're trying to do nature-based solutions. One of the big problems St. Clair Shores has is they're from the Midwest. Everybody in the Midwest has a basement. Of course we want to have a basement, even if we're right next to the lake and every time it floods, our basement floods. They need to try and figure out how to get people to think about maybe it's time to fill in our basement and not keep flooding and damaging it and elevate homes. They probably won't retreat. They may elevate and do some of that eventually over time. That kind of stuff. A lot of the same methods, lessons again that Alex just talked about. Get diverse stakeholders at the group as quickly as you can and get everybody. Don't allow the discussion to be driven by just the shorefront property owners. Because if you do, you're pretty sure you're going to get armoring as the solution they want. The rest of the community has a stake in this. They need to be part of that engagement upfront and early too. And they need to be there talking to the shorefront property owners so that you can step back and let them engage and not lecture them that way. So it all takes a champion too. There needs to be a local leader who's taking this on and pushing it through. So they are trying to get grant funding to do this again. If you're in a community or you know of a community that might want to step through this same exercise, then I encourage you to reach out to Jenna and Eleanor, because they're interested, if we get this funding, to work with communities and try this again. So my short take on it is it had some real positive benefits in terms of community engagement. It didn't move the needle much in a near-term way, at least in getting folks to think about meaningfully about managed retreat. That's the first presentation. You have clarifying questions. I'll do my best to answer, but I may have to punt because and let you reach out to Jenna.
Mine's actually not really about the process, more about, you just mentioned, don't allow the, only the shorefront owners to dictate the conversation and the plans. Where is the line, literally the line in the sand of where these shorefront owners own to?
So in Michigan, yeah, this is a good question. I'll talk about that more actually in my presentation next, but I'll just say quickly. So we do, all of the Great Lakes states have recognized the public trust doctrine as applying to the Great Lakes shoreline. So in Michigan, shorefront property owners own to the water's edge, but there's a public trust interest up to the ordinary high water mark. So when the lakes are really super high, there's no beach and you can't walk. But most of the time there's a beach there. And under Michigan law, you have a right to walk along the beach. One of the things legally now, one of the questions that hasn't been asked, what if you've armored the shoreline and there's no beach, but there would have been a beach there but for the armoring? Does that mean people can walk along your seawall? Hasn't been litigated yet, so I don't know the answer to that. And like St. Clair Shores, people go to the public beaches, there are a few public beaches, but they generally don't try and walk on their neighbors' front lawn. So it is been substantially developed, and it's hard to see them thinking seriously about pulling up the seawalls and telling the property owners, say goodbye to your house. Thanks. Other questions? Let me shift to my second presentation. So help me out. So here again, so this work, I've done a lot of work with the state of Michigan's coastal management program because they're really trying to help coastal communities pay more attention to their shorelands and plan for them. So we did a study a few years back looking at master plans in Michigan and published a paper that I titled Overlooking the Coasts. Most of the master plans of coastal communities in Michigan didn't even mention that they were a coastal community. Really said nothing about coastal shoreline adaptation management. You wouldn't even know they were a coastal community except they had a picture of a lighthouse on the cover. I think what was going on is a lot of the local planning in Michigan is done by consultants. Most of the planning consultants work for inland communities. They have a template plan process and format they use. They just used it for the coastal communities and kind of forgot that, oh, they're coastal, maybe you ought to deal with that well. And the communities that didn't use planners actually did a much better job of addressing the coastal areas in their planning efforts. So something was motivating them. So now what's happening over time, this is happening everywhere. It used to be, what, 20 years ago, we didn't have good data, we didn't have good methods. Community was like, what do we do? What do we do? Now there is so much stuff out there. It's almost the other problem. It's a fire hose of data and information coming at them. And every state agency's solution to solve the problem is to create another guidebook. We'll just make a new online tool. The local officials will pick it up and use it, and everything will be solved, just like that. And Michigan is trying to do that, and they wanted me to do a white paper on how to do, what are the best practices to do for coastal management. I said, we don't need that. We don't need another guidebook. We don't need another tool. Maybe we need a best management process to help communities figure out how to use all of the guidebooks and tools out there. So I approached it much more that way. So what I'm presenting now is a white paper that I wrote for the coastal management program, and there's a QR code later. You can get to it if you're interested in it, if I get your interest going. So let me give you a little bit more background. The Laurentian Great Lakes were formed by glaciers retreating about 13,000 years ago. They're leftovers from the glaciers. Most of the lake shorelines are sandy, gravelly, highly erodible shores. So again, we're above sea level on the Great Lakes. We're like 600 feet above sea level. So we're not going to feel the effects of sea level rise, but the shorelines are still receding landward nonetheless because of the kinds of shorelines that we have. If you think about the Great Lakes, you don't think so much about being in the water. You think about where people experience them, which is on the beach, on the shoreline. And we are the Great Lakes state. Michigan One of my favorite bumper stickers is 4 of the 5 Great Lakes prefer Michigan. Because we have 4 of the 5 Great Lakes touching us, touching our boundaries, and Michigan doesn't promote seawalls as the thing to come and see. They promote big sandy beaches. You've heard of the Pure Michigan campaign. Come and enjoy the beach here. And it's also the case that our near shore coastal lands are highly productive ecologically. That's where a lot of the nurseries are in the nearshore system. So there are a lot of good reasons to want to protect the natural shoreline on our Great Lakes. And Michigan has about 3,200 miles of coastal shoreline. So we've got about 2/3 of the US side of the Great Lakes. So even though it's a single state, we manage a lot of the state shorelines. Just a little bit of history. People started the state, incorporated as a state in the 1837. People were moving there by the early 1800s. They started to build channels for navigation. And then I think we're trying to document this now. Anecdotally, I'm pretty sure people have been building bigger homes closer to the water, especially over the last couple decades. So it's like there's a collision coming of these natural forces moving the shoreline landward remorselessly. At the same time, people are wanting to build bigger and bigger homes that are more permanent, closer to the water's edge. I like to say people want to live in exactly the most beautiful, fragile, dangerous, expensive places all at the same time, instantly on the water. So we've got that collision coming. This is just repeating the hydrograph that I showed earlier. Sure, I'm seeing. Okay, so that was a record high in 86. A very long period of record lows stretching to 2013. It actually hit the record low in 2013 on Lake Michigan. And then in a short period of time, the lake level came back up again over 7 years. There's a sine wave function going on here, but you see it's kind of patterns within patterns. So long periods where it's above the long-term average, long periods where it's below, but it's always moving. So it's a highly dynamic system. I think it's more challenging in a way to manage the Great Lakes because they do go down long enough for people to forget. And then they want to build, and then you get into trouble when the lakes come back up. The prediction right now by the climate scientist modelers are that we're going to start to see more frequent fluctuations going to more extremes. So we have really low periods of low, and then everybody who's got a dock can't get their boat out into the water because the water's out there. So we have these problems at both ends of the extremes, and they're predicting we're going to start getting more of those more frequently. And most of that is natural. There's very little that you can do to control the lake levels. Some people argue, why aren't you managing those lake levels better? Because we can. They're big, huge dynamic systems. It's just the climate, it's the hydrodynamics of the climate, precipitation and rain events. It's just a natural cyclical cycle. And there's, it's just a natural process that we can't manage. Okay. At the same time, we're building closer to the shore, just a little bit on erosion. So I do have colleagues that have mapped the long-term shoreline movement. The blue line is where the shore moved from over the last 80 years. The orange lines are where the bluffs have gone, and the red is where we think the bluffs are going. There will be a lot of structures that are at risk in the foreseeable future because a lot of our shorelines are bluffs too. It's a little bit hard to see bluffs down to sandy beaches. And when bluffs fail, they go fast and they go in a big way. They don't just chew away slowly. So you'll have these large chunks of land loss. And the problem with the lake, this progression of the lake is it's a dance. The shorelines erode really quickly when the lakes are high, and then they come back a little bit. And then they go really fast when they're high, and then come back a little bit. So it's a very disjointed process that we're struggling with. That's just an image to show you. We do have harbor structures, and they basically function like really big groins. So the people updrift of those are benefiting greatly because they have nice big inflated beaches, but it's accelerating the erosion downdrift. And the Army Corps built those, and with the promise that they would bypass sand, and then they decided they didn't want to spend that money, so they've stopped doing that. So their lawsuits pending, and the Corps is fighting them fiercely because if they admit that they're liable there, they're going to have to admit they're liable everywhere, and it's a mess legally. So the big issues are inundation and especially shoreline erosion. The last time the lakes were really high, that our State Department of Great Lakes gave out, the state officials have said this publicly, they gave out way too many permits, like 2,000 permits to build armoring structures. They were giving them away like candy. because property owners were so desperate to try and protect their homes. This is just to illustrate this a little bit. That's a beach shortly after the really last long period of high water. The shores eroded, they put in some rubble to try and stop it. That's what it looked like after that really long period of low water. It inflated the beach. That's actually in front of the house that I showed you earlier. They started to build a house thinking they've got a whole lot of beach. And before they could even build it up, all of that beach was gone. Because when the lakes come back up, they chew away all of that unconsolidated sand really fast. So now they're sticking out into the lake. There is concern about people losing their homes into the lake. That's kind of driving a lot of the concern. So we got a lot of that. And now we get into, Alex mentioned this briefly too, shoreline armoring actually makes it worse. It starts to cause erosion at the end of the shoreline. If you build a shoreline and your neighbor doesn't, you're going to cause your neighbor's property to erode faster. This is a little bit harder to see, but if you kind of see where the natural beach is, if you look to the left, you can kind of see a sandbar sitting there. That's the sand that will come back when the lakes drop again. What they're now documenting is when you build seawalls, the scouring pushes the sand much further out into the lake and it's lost in the system. So even when the lakes come back up, there isn't enough sand in the nearshore system to restore the beach. So we're really worried that over the years, enough farming is going to go in that even when the lakes go down, that we won't get beaches back because the sand is too far out in the system. And in fact, Ohio, so this is the Ohio-Michigan thing, right? I'm at Michigan, go blue. Our chair here is from Ohio State. I grew up in Ohio, so I can say this. I actually grew up close to Lake Erie. Ohio has a very property owner-friendly system. They recognize ownership to the water's edge, and the public trust only goes to the water's edge. So if you want to be in the public trust in Lake Erie, you have to be out in the water. Your ankles have to be wet, and so they've allowed a lot of armoring. So most of Lake Erie has been armored. There's very little natural shoreline left on Lake Erie. So I plead with my Michiganders, please let's not be like Ohio. But this is where we might be headed. That's the kind of stuff that was going in after the last shoreline. This is just to point out, armoring is not a permanent solution. The lakes are powerful. They will eventually undermine the systems, and you can go up and down the lake and see the remnants of seawalls past. And then they just keep building them bigger, so they'll last a bit longer, but they'll be a bigger mess when they finally fail. Lots of debris out in the water. So now we're left with this terrible, terrible dilemma. Do we armor or do we withdraw? So that was a big house that got built way too close to the shoreline. The city passed a setback to say, we're not going to let you build walls. They had to pick it up and move it back. That happens seldomly because communities have a really hard time finding the political will to do that. The way I frame it to get people's attention is, what are we going to decide? Are we going to save our beach house or are we going to save the beach? Well, most of these highly dynamic systems, you can't have it both ways. You're going to have to decide we're going to protect one, but you know that's coming at the expense of the other. Just quickly, some institutional challenges. We do have federal laws that affect what's going on the shoreline, largely through the Coastal Management Act, which gives pass-through funding to go down to local governments. The states have a lot of authority to regulate, but most in this country, most of the authority to regulate coastal shorelands, that area beyond the shoreline itself, is in local government hands through planning and zoning authorities. We do have the public trust doctrine in Michigan. It recognizes this movable freehold when the shoreline, when the lakes go down and the beaches get bigger, private property gets bigger too. You own the water's edge, so you've got a bigger beach that's yours. There's a public trust right to walk on the beach, but you still own that underlying property. But when the shoreline recedes because the lakes have come back up, it converts automatically to state submerged bottomlands, converts to state-owned submerged bottomlands. So the courts have recognized that, even a very conservative court acknowledge that immovable freehold, and you have the right to stroll. This is what I just described. When it accretes, you get more land, but when it recedes, you lose land. And in most of the beaches, the sandy beaches, the long-term trend is recession. We also have an institutionally, Michigan is a township state, so we have in between counties, in cities and villages, we have townships. So Michigan has 1,852 units of local government. 1,200 of them are civil townships. They've all been enabled to plan and zone, and by God, they're not gonna let anybody else do it for them. So we have something like 200, almost 300 units of government that touch one of our Great Lakes. They're all been enabled to plan and zone. More than 90% of them have fewer than 10,000 residents. They're rural places. We have very little capacity to be sophisticated at all analytically. Oh my gosh. So there are lots of, I just document lots of state authorities. For all of that authority, all the state acts and the public trust doctrine, they really only regulate right up to the water's edge. They're only regulating the shoreline. All of the shoreland that's landward of that will eventually become shoreline and a receding beach are left to the local governments. So now we're into the problem of overlooking the coast. If most of them are not paying attention to their coastal shorelines, a whole lot of development is happening that's eventually going to be in the public trust domain, but it's not been stopped because nobody's been thinking through, maybe we should let people build that close. Less than we have all of the problems with private property. All of the good things with private property and the checks on governmental ability to act. Okay, so here's the best management process now. I have no idea where I am on time. I'll just go really fast. So basically, the trick is you've got to get people, you got to get through the processes that Alex was talking about. There's a whole lot of learning that has to happen by public officials. How do these dynamics actually work? What's really going on here? What do we mean by the different terms? Then you need to know, how does it play out in our own particular community, in our particular assets? You need to do some good planning because you need to make your zoning actions legally defensible. And then you need to start figuring out what are the right best management practices for us. And here's where I'm trying to get folks to think about the options. So generally, coastal shoreline managers lay out an array of options from the resist. We're going to fight Mother Nature no matter what. We're going to build seawalls. We're going to stop that erosion, all the way to relocate. Managed retreat is really on the far end. It's like we're giving up from a property owner's perspective. We're just going to move back and let Mother Nature take the course, or somewhere in the middle, there beach renourishment or nature-based solutions. The problem with both of those things is on a really high energy coast, they're impermanent and they're expensive. And if you really build a nature-based seawall that's effective, you built a seawall with a tree on it. It's still a seawall. It's still going to have all of the same effects. So it's really not a good option over the long term. You can lay that on an array of how are we going to manipulate and then go from low to high energy systems. I'm not going to lay all of this out, but it's possible to lay out for a community. Here are the outcomes you're going to get depending on what you decide to do, given the level of energy in the system that you're working with. If you're lucky, you have some shoreline that's naturally replenishing itself and you don't need seawalls. Good for you. You're one of the lucky few. But if most of the shoreline on Lake Michigan is high energy eroding, if you try and stop it, you're going to have problems that will catch up with you. So the very first thing you have to do is recognize trade-offs. 4 T's here: trade-offs, triage, tailor, and transition. Lots of text here. I'm not going to step through it, but basically here's the key trade-off. If you build a seawall to protect the beach house, you'll protect the beach house for a time. As long as you maintain the seawall, you'll lose your natural beach. If you decide you're going to protect the natural beach, you're going to have to pick up your house and move it back because it's just a matter of time before the lake gets there. Those are the core trade-offs. Communities try hard to ignore that or not recognize it, but those are the trade-offs they need to grapple with. Once you get the trade-offs down, let's start thinking about triage. Okay, Chicago is not going to pick up and move back from the shoreline. There are places that are just so heavily developed and there's so much public infrastructure. You probably need to just reconcile the idea that it's going to be armored and it's always going to be armored and we're going to pay over time to keep it armored. But maybe that doesn't have to be every place. Maybe there are some places that have been a little bit developed, but it's still time to say we still want that to be natural. We're going to figure out how to get folks to move back. That's the triage part. There's a big problem, I can tell you, with communities looking for best management ordinances on the web. And they pull them down and they just like change the label and they adopt them and they have no idea what they adopted or why. And it doesn't really work for their community. So I'm really pushing on communities hard. Don't paste and cut off the web. You'll get yourself into trouble. It's worth hiring an attorney who knows what they're talking about and tailor it the right way. And then look for ways to transition. You may have started to develop, but maybe there are areas where you can go back to having a natural shoreline. And that may be use your zoning to declare some structures non-conforming uses. and tell property owners, you can have them as long as you have them, but when they get damaged too much by a storm, you'll have to take them out. So you'll be there for a while, but at some point you're gonna have to retreat. Those are all really difficult, painful conversations to have. That's this white paper is available up on the Global Center website. I'm related with the Global Center for Transboundary Waters at U of M. So it's publicly available. So I'm just trying to get local communities to recognize we have to make some really hard decisions. And somebody said this earlier, trying to decide not to decide is actually making a decision. You kind of, I'm not gonna decide, no, we're just gonna keep going. You're probably making the decision to develop way more than you should in places you shouldn't allow development, and you're gonna pay the price. It'll come back and get you. You just can't ignore it. So we're heading for some really difficult challenges. That's that paper. So,
And for one or two quick questions while we transition, yeah.
Thank you so much for your talk. I was at the public trust doctrine talk as well. And I guess building upon the first presentation into your current presentation, to what degree, or I mean, maybe geographic extent or extent at all, should inland communities or communities that still benefit from the public trust of the shoreline and benefit from beaches existing be included and involved in these conversations about planning?
yeah, so at the very least, this the comment I made earlier, for a coastal community that's engaged in this kind of planning, absolutely needs to make sure that the other residents in the community are part of that process, and it's not just the shoreline residents. It's a little bit more of a stretch to get neighboring communities to get involved too. But I would love for everybody in the state of Michigan who thinks of the Great Lakes state as being the places where you go to the beach to recognize what's happening. I think so many folks just don't understand the decisions are being made. And usually when I talk to folks and talk about what I do, their first reaction is, well, of course we have to let those property owners have their beach house. Well, why wouldn't we let them build a seawall? And then I explain, here's what happens when you build a seawall. Oh, no, we don't want that to happen. There's a whole lot of education that needs to go on. So at least getting the inland neighbors in the community involved is really important. To the extent that you can get a broader community going, that'll be important for the local planning. That'll be especially important if the state legislature takes this up again. The last time our Michigan legislature dealt with coastal issues, they were responding to a cranky, very wealthy coastal property owner who wanted to build on a dune, and the state said, you can't do that. We've got dune protection acts. The state legislature eviscerated the dune protection law and then preempted local government getting eviscerated. They greatly weakened the coastal dune protection, and they preempted local government from regulating more fiercely. So the state administrative officials are really nervous about the state legislature getting involved with this because it could get worse. They could actually take away authorities. So we're just trying to start up some research that would educate state legislators on here are the long-term consequences of what you might do if you go down that road. And I would love to get people from more inland communities involved with that too, because they've got a stake in this as well.
We do need to move on, but if we have time, I will open it up to everybody. Just want to make sure we get to the last speaker. So last but not least, we have Ellen Chappelka from the Washington Military Department of Emergency Management. And Ellen, are you able to share your screen?
Yes. Should you guys see it now?
Not yet.
Okay. On my end, it says it's sharing.
Okay, wait, we can see it. We're just.
There
we go. We got it.
Okay, perfect. So yeah, as she said, my name is Ellen Chappelka. I work for the Washington State Emergency Management Division, and I am on our Interagency Coastal Hazards Resilience Team, or the cohort, with all of my partner agencies that you see listed below. So the Department of Ecology in Washington State put this team together and funds us. Sea Grant Washington is one of our core partners, and WSU Extension. And the idea behind this is that each of our agencies has an area of expertise that relates to coastal hazards that the other agencies cannot independently fill. And when we work together, that saves communities burdens of trying to reach out to each one of us individually and helps move efforts together collectively. And I think it's important to note that this work is funded by Washington's Climate Commitment Act. So that's our cap and trade model on carbon usage. And all of that funding goes towards adapting to climate change. So the cohort, as I said, is our team, and it was developed collaboratively in response to actual requests from the community. So in Washington State, as the state, we're trying very hard to hear and be receptive to what our communities need rather than this like continued top-down approach as to us telling them what they need. Especially since we do have a very extreme hazard landscape. Like most states, we're dealing with sea level rise, we're dealing with increased coastal inundation, but in the back of our minds, we're always also thinking about the possibility of a Cascadia subduction zone earthquake and the potential for a resultant tsunami that could have devastating impacts to our Pacific coast and also inner coast communities. So where did this team come from? I think like everybody else in government, it's very slow to build a team in an interagency model, especially. So in 2017, we had sort of first inklings of this team getting developed, and that came from a coastal resilience assessment, which identified that our state, especially in the more rural, underserved communities, have huge capacity gaps, and the needs they weren't able to meet the needs that their communities had. So as a next step, the William D. Ruckelshaus Center, which was at that time part of WSU Extension, did a report outlining options for dealing with the gaps identified in the 2017 report. And one of the key takeaways was creating our interagency team to meet the community's needs. In 2022, we were able to pilot this with our resilience action demonstration. And that at the time was just 2 agencies, Washington Sea Grant and the Department of Ecology. And they successfully proved that state agencies partnering together and going into communities can help push forward resilience efforts, enough so that the legislature officially formed us in 2023. So Washington works on a biennial budget. We just are coming to the close of our first biennium, and we have funding to continue into the second biennium, which is very exciting given the state of federal funding right now. And our mission is to work collectively with tribes and diverse and underserved communities to co-create resilience projects. And it's written there, but what I really want to draw attention to is the words collaboratively and co-create. So we want to go and hear what the communities are saying, see what they're experiencing, and then use our expertise with their local knowledge to develop an appropriate solution for the location. And this can look like a lot of things. We tend to show this graphic. This graphic is not necessarily, does not need to be completed in this order by every community. But if we came to a community and they were at the very early stages of ideating around a problem, we'd start at the top of this graphic and see what the priorities are. And we do that through various methods. But as they go through this process, we're there, we can be there every step of the way, helping in whatever way that looks most useful to them. So it's very difficult to explain my job to people. It's very difficult to explain my job when I'm working with communities, because what we do really differs based on the needs of each individual community we work with. So the first one I mentioned was addressing community priorities. Every community sees things a little bit differently. So we want to go in and make sure that we're hearing from them. We're a very small team, all in. We're about 13, and there are 4 core staff, 1 from each agency. So that means we are doing all of this engagement with just basically 4 FTE plus a little from our leadership. But in our first biennium, we've had over 300 engagement events and reached over 4,200 people across our 15 coastal counties in Washington, which was in the first year especially, we just wanted to hear all of the problems. And now in our second year, we're thinking about strategizing and strategizing the ways we can use this engagement and use that time to move forward holistic visions of resilience. So I cannot be there in person right now because we are doing that exact strategic planning today in Washington. And once we hear once we hear what communities' priorities are, we can move forward towards the co-creation of projects. So the photo on the screen right now is from a workshop series that we funded and helped run called Wakayakum Common Ground, where the entire idea of it was to bring people together in this community where they self-identified as their biggest challenge being that they could not agree on things and did not get along. And so we tried to help find the common ground by showing them successful resilience projects and showing the benefits it had to farmers, to fish, anti-flooding, which is kind of our like trifecta in Washington, in rural Washington. So we'd like to host these community workshops like everybody in the coastal resilience space. And one thing we really like to emphasize in these community workshops is having a two-way communication between the communities and having a series of them. So the information they give us in the first workshop will influence what we do in the second and third and fourth workshops. So we'll have them start by identifying problems, and then we'll come back and present some solutions based on the problems they've identified. And then they'll give us feedback, or if they have a desire, in particular in rural Washington, dredging is frequently brought up. So we'll take the time in between workshop series and actually get somebody to run the model for us and see if dredging would be a feasible solution, and then bring it back to them and see, even though we know that this seems like it'd be a good solution, we did the math, turns out like dredging might not be perfect. But it really like helps to like build trust in these communities by showing that we listened, we did the work, and we're responding based off of their feedback. We also do a lot of technical assistance, and this is especially important. There tends to be, I think, in Washington, as many other states, a trust gap between many of the state government workers who either live in Seattle or Olympia, our state capital, and many of the people we're trying to work with who live far away from both of those cities. And so by being there, we're able to serve as that conduit between academia, state resources, and federal resources, that they're able to get it in ways that they perhaps would not, or would not feel like comfortable or part of the in-group accessing without a liaison. And since we have 4 different state agencies and all of our associated connections, we're really able to like serve as more than the sum of our parts. We also offer direct technical assistance. So when we do go through that project identification process after a workshop, or if somebody comes to us with a project they want to do, we'll help do technical assistance on it. One of our team members is a coastal engineer, so sometimes this can mean looking at the feasibility of this project. What is the most appropriate intervention that could be done here? What are ways we could green this project up? Could we do a nature-based solution instead of a seawall? And so we'll get hands-on with actual projects. From my lens as an emergency manager, I try and make sure that it is actually supporting emergency management priorities across this project and not just addressing one chunk. So everything we do, we like it to be multi-benefit, good for people, good for the environment, and good for, our ESA listed species in the area. Kind of a pipe dream. You can't get all of them every time, but that's we're always pushing towards that direction. One of the ways we provided technical assistance last year is that from going out and doing all that engagement, one of the gaps that we identified is that we have pretty bad winter storms in Washington that cause dramatic erosion. It can cause lack of access between communities and services such as healthcare, food, and also just documenting what's happened so that historically we're able to get a disaster declaration and get some of that repair cost refunded. So based off of the input we heard from communities, we put together a Washington State Winter Storms Forum where we went through the science of winter storms to the process of responding to winter storms to what you do after a winter storm, and trying to check all the boxes from the habitat, the people, and safety. One of the other things, of course, that we like to do is work on capacity building. We've been trying to understand the best ways to help communities. When we go into them, we frequently hear, I wish climate change were my biggest problem, but unfortunately, the economy is my biggest problem. This town is hollowing out. We don't have the workforce to do even the construction projects we get funded to do. So we've been trying to help address those issues through a couple different pathways. The first is a 2-year resilience fellowship. That's part of our NOAA CRRC grant that we received last year. So our Coastal Resilience Regional Challenge grant. We have a fully funded, so we, NOAA, pay for the fellows to be embedded in communities for 2 years. And that's supposed to help address the capacity. There is somebody there to write the grants. There is somebody there to take the time to integrate plans. And there's somebody there who lives in the area and knows it well and can act as an extension of the cohort team. We've also partnered with our state Career Connect office. So they train people to go into various vocations that we are lacking in Washington State. So we're working on them and developing pathways to get people into coastal resilience jobs in Washington. And our dream that our legislature has approved for us but not funded is a small grant program to do ourselves so that we're able to directly give communities money to do the very starts of the work. Initially, this is kind of conceptualized as grants, but we're hoping to get into actual like capital budgets where people can use it for design or like small scale implementation. We also do a lot of grant support. We've helped our communities apply for over $134 million worth of grants, 84 million of which were successful. The other 50 million are pending, but since they were federal, we should say seems unlikely for most of it. But we're lucky enough in Washington State to have internal state grants. And one of the things we prioritize is passing projects between the different state agencies. So Ecology runs Floodplains by Design, which has a grant program for addressing risks to coastal communities. And if a project that we're aware of is unsuccessful in Floodplains by Design, Ecology will send it to me and I'll see if there's any emergency management grants that we could make it with instead, just by kind of reframing or reconceptualizing what this project's going to do, because it's very hard to like build a project that is good for a floodplain that is not also good for reducing risk. And for all of our communities, we offer to write letters of support when appropriate. We will help, we'll assist in reviewing the grant and connect them with other people who might be good partners when they're developing grants. And then, of course, we also do planning. We love to do everything. We lend our finger in every pot. At the Emergency Management Division, we are the state owners of the hazard mitigation plans. Ecology owns the Shoreline Master Program planning, which is a Washington State requirement. And then we tend to do a lot of sea level rise planning, but we try to get as hands-on as we can. So we will embed ourselves in these planning processes. I sit in on many of the county's hazard mitigation planning processes to make sure that we're thinking about nature-based solutions when we're doing these plans, that we're thinking about coastal hazards, that we're thinking about sea level rise, and that their plans are aligning with the way the state is looking at risks and vice versa, that we are aligning how we are looking at risks based on how our communities are. And since we are all about working together and building bigger teams, we try and do that through enhancing other regional partnerships. Most notably, as I alluded to, we got the NOAA CRRC grant. So we set up projects, our communities set up projects and we helped coordinate the projects all throughout the state to meet various different resilience needs on different scales. This slide is the start to a project that on its own, or presentation that on its own takes 30 minutes. So I think I'll just leave that as something to be aware of. And we have developed a huge amount of partners through those efforts. And here I just wanted to end with this slide that shows where throughout Washington State we've done work and what we've done, and also kind of leave it on the note of what we've done around managed retreat. I think like everyone else, our communities are not particularly excited about that word, much less the concept. But we also have tribes in Washington that feel very differently about managed retreat. So we've been supporting the Makah, the Hoh, the Quinault, the Shoalwater Bay tribe, all in their efforts to relocate uphill. So it looks different for every tribe, but we've been trying to offer state support for those projects wherever able. And sometimes that means connections to commerce and helping them develop microgrids rather than trying to redo their entire electrical infrastructure in very, very rural areas where it's very difficult to get connected to the public utility. Or going to community meetings and helping facilitate those meetings to make sure that the community's voices are heard. Sometimes it's nice for the tribes to have a little bit of an outside voice so that they're able to, so that the people who work there are also able to participate as community members, or so that it's not kind of community versus community. We're very good at coming in and being a little bit of the bad guy, a little bit of just an outside voice. And we're thinking about how we address hazards across various scales and how we address it holistically with the knowledge that the funding landscape has shifted dramatically and that the hazards, I think, are outpacing our ability to respond to them everywhere. So we're not, as a state, going to encourage managed retreat as like a state policy since we are a home rule state, but we're exploring what to do when communities are interested in it or when it becomes necessary due to critical infrastructure failures. So I think that's it for me. Thank you for giving the time. We have a QR code. Feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions about how we operate. We're happy to talk with anyone. We just did a knowledge exchange with the Maine Coastal Zone Management Program, and that was super helpful, I think, for both ends to learn about how different states do it. So always happy to chat. Sharing.
Okay, we can take some questions for Ellen. I think she should be able to hear you. And I'll also invite our other speakers maybe to come up to the front because we'll have about 10 minutes for open questions. But questions for Ellen specifically. Okay, while you're thinking about those, Ellen, if you want to stay on, we'll just do some open questions. So any questions for any of the speakers?
Yeah, I have a question about the scale of the consultation and the fact that it started with just listening to the problems. Something I've encountered a lot is that when you go in only to ask about problems, then the reaction is often that people have talked about that plenty enough already, and they would like to get to solutions. I mean, maybe that's a different context, but I'm curious to hear how you experienced that going in maybe in a like more of a listening position, if that's ever been a problem actually for future engagement.
Yeah,
I guess
Yeah, yeah, I was, and both of you, I think. Sorry, I missed the beginning of your.
I'll just go ahead quickly since I can't see you guys, so I'm gonna assume it's okay for me to talk. But it's definitely a very real problem, and I try and be very upfront about it, of being like, all I can offer right now is my attention. But also we try and like jump in and like leverage existing networks. So very rarely am I going to a community and being like, hey, what's going on here? It's coming in and being like, hey, we've heard from our partners that you're having this issue. Like, we think we might have an ability to help, like, talk us through it. Like, let's see how we can move it forward. And then also pointing to examples where, like, as we all know, government work can take years and years and years. So showing that, you know, even just the like creation of our team, showing them that, hey, you asked for this and the state listened and now we're here and we're working on it. So it's not just conversations. And we have quite a few projects that have like been developed and put in the works. And so we can show that, hey, these plans did lead to something, but that means that is like a key driver for us is to make sure that these conversations go somewhere, or if we're unable to take them further at this time, being upfront about that.
Yeah, I can jump in. I think fatigue is a really big problem, especially if there's been multiple different attempts at resilience and conversations around that. So one of the things that we try to do is make our work really iterative. So our first session is really sitting and trying to understand the general idea and values of the area. The next meeting, we are repeating back, this is what we heard you say. Does this still resonate? And with that, providing, once you can or as soon as you're able to, the timeline of where this all plugs in and makes sense, especially because these processes can take so long. So if it's part of the same effort, I think that's easier than, like, I have colleagues in the Bay Area where a bajillion iterations of different resilience projects have been tried and the community's exhausted, they haven't seen results. So I think part of that comes back to like building trust with your organization or agency or whoever you're representing of, yes, this has not been fulfilled the way it could have been. This is what we're trying to accomplish and this is how. And again, providing incentives as best you can, trying to show that out of good faith, like you're not just asking them to show up to talk, but there's actually an effect of their participation, ideally. Obviously, not everyone's gonna get what they want, which can be tricky too, but.
So, and the work that we're doing in the same area and my own experience in government, I found that there were 3 reasons why agency folks can be really resistant to this. And we've all heard this, and I'm wondering if folks have ways to hack any of these. The first is, what does the community know anyway? The second is, we don't have time for this. And the third is, they'll never be satisfied, so why should we even start? And I'm sure a lot of people are rolling their eyes and experiencing, evil flashbacks, but any recommendations for dealing with that kind of hesitancy?
So you're doing this for community planning efforts or?
Community planning, co-creation.
Yeah. I'll start. I mean, at the end of the day, to be successful, you need to find the local officials who are going to be entrepreneurial champions and pull other people along. Because if you just try and do it and you're hitting those, I'm not sure what you can do to get around that. So finding the leadership, having some purpose behind what you're doing, and then having some goodwill. So I just recently got appointed to the City of Ann Arbor's Planning Commission, and we're updating our master plan, and that's where I'm hearing that kind of stuff.
In Ann Arbor.
In Ann Arbor, and a lot of we're having a housing crisis. We need to start allowing more density, and wow, the single family neighborhood residents are coming out of the woodwork. We are going to utterly destroy Ann Arbor. And it's really easy to kind of write them off, like, well, they don't know anything, or we're never going to make everybody happy. But you got to listen to them and recognize people are scared. They put a lot of investment into their community. They don't really know what's coming. In terms of reaching out to the community, there's a fine line. If you just go out and say, what do you want us to do? It's really hard for people out of the blue to come up with things. So you want to give them concrete ideas to think about or noodle on, but recognize that you're creating expectations. And then if you change it based on feedback you got, they're going to come back and say, well, you changed bait and switch. We're hearing this in Ann Arbor. You told us this, and now you're talking about that. And it's just a messy business. If you don't do it though, I mean, community planners know the history is replete with plans that have blown up because you didn't engage the community. So the alternative is we're just going to push it through as technical experts. Well, that's in the long run going to be a worse outcome. So there's just I'm not giving a very good answer. I mean, there's just no easy way to work through this. And especially in a coastal setting, I think you aren't going to ever, well, even in Ann Arbor with the affordable housing, not everybody's going to be satisfied. It's all about making trade-offs. How do you justify and get the community to buy in? This, on balance, is the sensible thing to do. Recognizing there are just some folks, like in this country, that are never going to be satisfied. You have to just acknowledge that and keep moving forward.
And if I can tack on that for just the strategy of, I've been a part of a lot of planning processes or feasibility studies where the city doesn't necessarily have, the agency doesn't have the directive to do this work, and the folks involved know how important it is, so they'll write in a surf rider or someone else in the community for their community engagement, and that group gets to handle and support that and be the human shield as you were. So I think there's also creative ways in grant writing on how to be able to, and also like agency or like in your organization, how to stress the importance and also leverage the support of community-based organizations and other folks who are doing a lot of that work already.
Well, I think I'm just editorialize a little bit too. We're, again, in my Ann Arbor experience, we're getting so much pushback now because people just really don't trust government because of what's happening at the federal level. That is definitely playing itself out at the local government level. And if we can't figure out how to work through a process at the local level and bring back a little bit of faith in government, maybe, I think we're all in trouble. So it's getting harder, but it's never been more vital to have good community engagement and trying to fair, reasonable processes to convince folks, yeah, these are problems we can work on together. Yikes.
Right, a question online.
Yeah, so we have a question from the chat. This participant asks, which tribes were looking at elements of retreat, and how can you expand on how tribes are thinking about retreat differently than other communities in the region?
Yeah, all coastal Washington tribes, so on the Pacific coast, are considering some element of, I don't know I mean, perhaps retreat, perhaps like expansion in the hills, like how they'd frame it. So they're all considering it. And I think it comes from like a recognition of each tribe is different. So I don't want to speak for them per se either, but I would say all of them are aware that these are very hazardous areas. The hazards are only going to get worse. And they've either had reservation land or have trust land now where they have the space to move and are motivated as a group to do it. I think what is particularly helpful for them is that the tribes are smaller communities. And so it is a finite number of houses that you're thinking about moving, or a finite number of community members, in a way that non-tribal communities are frequently just, the scale is very different. Did that get all the elements of the question?
Kind of thinking like how tribes are thinking about retreat generally.
Yeah, I think it's kind of the classic answer. They're thinking more generations in advance. Non-tribal communities have to work on election cycles, and tribal communities work also on election cycles, but I think are thinking longer term.
One more for any question? Yes.
Thank you all for the presentation. It's really great. I have a question for the first presentation. I know you mentioned like the targeted workshops, and that's kind of in your pre-planning phase. And you mentioned kind of doing those activities with like the risk assessment and mapping. I'm just curious, like how those activities have gone with the communities. I'm thinking because you did that relationship building at the beginning, it lends itself to maybe like a more productive conversation, but I'm just kind of curious.
Yeah, no, exactly. It was very, very strategic, or maybe mindful in trying to phase what kinds of conversations we were having with what groups at what time, because this site in particular is very loved exactly the way it is, and any change is really rejected. I think that's probably something everyone can relate to in this process. But so we'd already had this really strong relationship with our like inner core, where we're talking long term, and then with like the next tier out, we're talking more short term in what are the problems. We obviously need to solve it. We had a unique opportunity where state parks was about to lose their lease, and were just renewed for another 25 years. So there was a natural moment of, and now we can finally start long-term planning. So that next group that got brought in was still pretty, they were supported by those, I mean, really, I'm gonna call them elders. We had a lot of really amazing folks who've been lifetime lifeguards, or like just community members or tribal community members who hold a lot of respect, who have been in that core with us. So at that meeting, that first meeting where we had people talking about this for the first time, it provided, I think, some additional trust where we might not have developed those relationships yet, but there was at least some, I guess, some surface tension to our ideas to be able to kind of embark on that. Does that kind of answer a little bit? Thank you.
Okay, let's thank all of our speakers.